Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's DRHA Informatics Committee. In today's committee, we're going to be discussing the case of Mr. Kenneth Lister. This particular patient is currently in our ICU. He was found in his home by his neighbors. He was lethargic and unable to communicate. His records in the EHR here indicate that Mr. Lister has multiple comorbidities, including diabetes, heart failure with an ejection fraction of 30%, and a history of cancer. Mr. Lister's last documented admission occurred in 2011, and at this time he had a successful coronary angiogram. Following the procedure, the client had numerous events of hypoglycemia, even though before this admission his diabetes was well controlled at home. During this very same admission, the client also had a fall while trying to get out of bed. We do not know if Mr. Lister had any other admissions at any other hospitals in the area. He's currently in our ICU, as I said before, with elevated blood glucose in the 350s and irregular heart rate. The current plan is to send the client to the medical unit when he is stabilized, and as you are all aware, the ICU has currently been using intensive insulin therapy with a clinical decision support system, or IIT-CDSS. This is a new protocol designed to provide better control of blood glucose levels. Unfortunately, this new protocol has not been rolled out in all of our medical units. Adele will actually be speaking more about the ins and outs and how the ICU nurses use IIT-CDSS in the ICU. So if you'd like to take over, Adele.
Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.
As an ICU nurse, it is so very important that we integrate the IIT-CDS into our practice early in the care of the patient. It's so important that we avoid variability in the blood glucose levels, putting the patient at increased risk for mortality. And so we would initiate this insulin therapy protocol when the patient's glucose level exceeded the provider's preset orders. For example, a blood glucose level of 80 to 110 milligrams per deciliter. We would then manually enter this blood glucose value into our handheld device, and then all other pertinent information about the patient via keyboard, such as the dextrose, the method of drawing site, and then from there the IIT-CDSS will then calculate the patient's insulin doses, and the rate would be based on the current blood glucose level and previous scheduled results. And it would use then the computerized system would use a multiplier and estimate the patient's resistance based on their levels. And then as an ICU nurse, it would be very important that we maintain blood glucose control by monitoring the patient's blood glucose level at regular intervals, such as Q2 hours. And so that would be very important for our patient. And so prioritization and time management are very important for optimum care of a patient on our ICU unit. And so when we are communicating back and making the transition for our patients onto the medical unit, this is something that we would definitely want to communicate with the nurses and staff there, how important it is that we monitor the patient's blood glucose levels on a regular basis, and that we avoid overriding the system, the IIT-CDS's recommendations, and following the physician's order. So in particular, when it comes to communication, we want to make sure that the transition is smooth and safe for the patient. And so we want to definitely combine our written reporting and of blood glucose control with the nursing staff, either utilizing a standardized handoff of SBAR, but according to the article, a recent article by the European Handover Project in the Role of Nursing, Uh, Verbal communication augmented by written summaries are the most effective way that nurses can communicate information for a successful handover. So, as the ICU nurse, when I'm communicating with the medical unit, I would try to attempt to make all of our interactions with them in real time and as interactive as possible. We would try to provide as much information about the patient, utilizing either a pre-existing medical records, electronic medical records, but also providing ample time for the staff to ask questions if they do indeed have them regarding the patient, and providing adequate time for feedback. And so we cannot underestimate the importance of verbal communication with the staff when we're making that transition from the ICU unit to the step down unit of medical unit. And so, of course, utilizing the system is can be very challenging, and I'm looking forward hearing uh, comments from Todd regarding utilizing the system more effectively.
Thank you, Adele. And as you stated earlier, that the ICU nurses sometimes override the CDSS, and what I tried to do was research and investigate why that has taken place and what we can do to prevent that from them overriding the CDSS system. First of all, some of the nurses are unfamiliar and uncomfortable with the clinical decision support system. They don't understand it. They weren't trained appropriately on it. They didn't receive the proper orientation. So therefore, they're just unfamiliar and uncomfortable with it, and tend to override it. And a way to prevent that is to just trust the evidence-based practice and the protocols, procedures, and guidelines we've put in place in implementing the IIT CDSS and making sure that it is used properly. Secondly, there's some nurses that have an old school mentality. That's the way they've always done it, and they don't want to change. They use a sliding scale, for instance, and they haven't bought into the IIT CDSS protocol, and that's an old mindset and attitude that we need to break. And to help prevent that, we need to make sure that we hold those nurses accountable and that they follow our policies and procedures, and they use the protocol as it is intended to use. Additionally, according to Campion, May, Waitman, Osnes, Lorenzi, and Gadd's article, Characteristics and Effects of Nurse Dosing Overrides on Computer-Based Intensive Insulin Therapy Protocol Performance, 2011, nurses' overrides include concerns about hypoglycemia due to data trends, the administration of glucose-affecting medications, and comorbidities, as Jordan mentioned earlier, that this particular patient has, as well as disagreement with the dose recommendations and workflow issues. And as we all know, as nurses, that there are certain workflow issues that we have to compete against, and which brings us to what we're talking about with the transition from a critical care unit to a med-surg unit, that we have to work through those workflow issues and make sure that we're doing the right things for our patients. And we're, again, following the policies and procedures that we put in place. And as a result, as stated in the same study, when nurses elect to override, they overwhelmingly administered insulin doses that were less than recommended. Now, Jordan mentioned that earlier in the very beginning in his introduction, and that is highly important, and it's worth mentioning again that we've got to really control that and maintain and monitor that here from our standpoint. And finally, and according to Campion et al., nurse education, interface changes, and algorithm modifications will improve the IIT CDSS protocol compliance and blood glucose control. And that's why we're here. That's what we're trying to do. We're trying to implement ways to make sure that we're using the protocol as it was intended. And Teresa's going to talk a lot about that right now.
Okay. Thanks, Todd. Since all hospitals are going to data-driven care, this technology that's used in the ICU, this IITT. It's in my mind, in my research, it's a critical care CDSS that's used in the ICU. And when this patient, when we read the scenario, this patient is going to the med-surg unit once he is stable. So it seems the problem here, based on the question that I have, is do you think using a PDA in the hospital would have been helpful with communication between the nursing staff? And what I'm seeing is that there's a knowledge deficit of when the patient is to be transferred over to the med-surg unit, and how those nurses, they don't have a plan about how they're going to communicate that. ICU staff is concerned about that. So, you know, I might suggest using an iPad and to build on what you said, Adele, about a bedside handoff. This would be a perfect tool to use for the ICU nurse to explain to the med-surg nurse the history of those critical readings, blood glucose readings, and the patient's progression, and how they got him to a stable point. So they could see that, even though they're not trained on it, formally trained on it. But so that is a solution. But also, I think we need to address how we're going to orient these med-surg nurses so there's easy transition in the future. Once we get over this hurdle with this patient, it'll be improved communication. And I've got some information here that if they perhaps when they implemented the CDSS in the ICU, if they would have used a fishbone strategy to look at how they were integrating this new technology and where it was going to touch and follow a patient within the hospital system. It's a good way to gather data that would help IT implementation efforts, so the systems are not superimposed on existing workflow practices, but are better effectively integrated to achieve improved patient outcomes. And this was recommended in a 2012 article from the magazine Computers, Informatics, Nursing by authors Moore and Fisher. I also ran across something else, some important information in a recent article in Nursing Management from Cheryl Fisher about competencies to enhance practice and personalized decision support at the point of care, because this monitoring of the blood glucose is a point of care that's done at the bedside. The Tiger Initiative also was discussed in this article, and it discusses 3 subsets of competencies that are important for all nurses as we integrate into electronic health records. And the first one is information literacy, clinical information management, and then just the basic computer skills that I think, Todd, you discussed. You know, on a med-surg unit, you're going to have novice nurses all the way up to the most highest experienced nurses on those floors. And with this knowledge that we see, clearly there's a deficit here. The nurses can provide clinical care and easily access and utilize and implement and communicate care requirements based on evidence. And so I think I've answered that question about the knowledge deficit. And Celeste, if you'd like to add on to that.
I would. Thank you, Teresa. I would like to go back to Adele. I also am going to be talking about some other options that can be used, some new technological devices, which were not as plentiful as I had anticipated or had hoped. But I appreciate you, Adele, talking about how those things are utilized in the ICU. And we all know that the ICU nurses are much higher level trained and are used to working with algorithms with nitroglycerin and other medications. One of the real concerns that I see happening is with the knowledge deficit is actually a protocol-based transition. The BMJ Open published a study back in 2013 by Stelfox et al. Talking about identifying ICU discharge planning tools and protocols. And so one of their discussions is have an actual standardized protocol through the electronic health record where very specific information decided upon all the multiple units about what really was pertinent information. You all have, we're all nurses, we've been in a situation where we've taken report, the monitors are going off, the phone's ringing, we're only hearing about half of what we're getting. And so I think a standardized tool that I can physically look at while I'm getting while the nurse, the med-surg nurse would be getting that information would be very beneficial. So that's the first part. So in addition to a handoff bedside communication, some kind of protocol tool that I can physically read and we can make sure that all of the information is shared about every patient every time, same information. The other thing that I would like to suggest in this patient is because we're talking about very limited knowledge by the med-surg nurse on the unit, is the use of telemonitoring, our telemonitoring nurse. Now we know that this patient also has a history of heart failure and other comorbidities, history of falls. So we have the trifecta. We've got diabetes that is not managed well. He's in the 350 still. Obviously that should come down before he transfers to the unit, or my hope, or out of the unit. My hope is that. Number two, that his irregular heartbeat is either medication controlled or at a rate control through medication before transition. So there's no titrating drips. Obviously that would not be done on the med-surg floor. But and then the third is the fall. So by utilizing the telehealth nurse as a second set of eyes for that med-surg nurse, and as a collegiate, a colleague, assistant, someone that they can just real-time talk to, say, okay, I have a blood sugar of XYZ. I think that's another option. So as far as the other options, in this particular case, we're limited because we're talking about a short period of time. But there are other technological devices that may help us in the future with transitioning patients. And one of those things is the continuous glucose monitor. Now this is not a new thing. Back in 2012, Ramchandani and Heptala, I hope I'm saying those right, in the International Journal of Pediatric Endocrinologies, they really looked at some of the new technologies for diabetes and reviewed all of these, and I must tell you I was really disappointed, and the authors of this study were too, that there wasn't more new things out. Back in, I think it was 2007, the interactive voice response can be used from a patient, talking into the device. Used to have to be done on a computer. Now the cell phone technology, you can do it through cell phones. But the big deal here, the big real time, the big dog is the continuous glucose monitoring, and the problem with the continuous glucose monitoring is that most insurance, including Medicaid, is not covering this. So that is a challenge I see with the CGM. But one of the benefits to our patients who would qualify for a CGM is that the CGM communicates directly to an insulin pump. So our individual algorithms could be programmed into each individual patient's pump. And so like in hypoglycemic unawareness, like in our type 1 patients, you really could get a warning sound at 3 a.m. when your sugars are dipping into the 40s. So I think that this technology has some definite possibilities, especially when we start thinking long-term discharge planning for this patient and further, especially if we cannot get his blood sugar controlled. Now, we did say, Jordan, you had said his blood sugar had been controlled prior to entry into the hospital, and I totally get that, but we have no idea kind of how that's going to transition to home. So this may be an option. And if the insurance doesn't pay, again, the interactive voice response, but we'd also have to evaluate mental status of patients, because that technology depends upon the patient's ability to manually enter information.
We also want to remember, too, that one of the biggest challenges that, according to Campion et al., the characteristics and effects of nursing dosing overrides, was the double documentation, the implementing of a blood glucose manually into a device, and then actually having to re-enter that information into maybe your e-medical record or in a separate system. So one of the recommendations was that the new CIS developers, they should try to reduce the amount and improve efficiency by reducing the amount of documentation that nurses need to make, even including our patients having to document every glucose level. So when we do have a device that interfaces into a centralized system, that definitely will reduce that and really improve efficiency.
That's the one benefit, I think, to the interactive voice response,
Exactly.
is because the verbiage, I mean, we all know when you dial in and call and you say, answer the following questions, we used to have to push the button. We don't have to do that anymore. We just speak what we want, and that voice recognition says that. Well, the new systems now, if the patient checks the blood glucose, let's say we can't do a continuous glucose monitoring, the patient calls in to a program number. They can do this from a landline. They don't even have to know how to use a cell phone. So that's one of the benefits. There's minimal technology for our elderly or our technology challenged patients. But number two, it's all voice activated, and it is automatically transitioned real time into the electronic health record. So that allows providers, home health nurses, telehealth nurses, whatever is chosen to use in the care of these patients, it allows real-time data. So if they are seeing a trend or they're being alerted, and let me mention that too, is if a patient calls in with the blood sugar and says my blood sugar is 50, in these systems, that the providers or the telemonitoring nurse in charge of that system is sent an emergent alert. So you're not checking these systems every 4 hours. If you've got a patient with a glucose of 50, you're getting an automatic alert, and that nurse is contacting the patient with information as to what to do to take care of that. So this, just the continuous glucose monitoring, the voice recognition. Let me also mention, again, from that same study from the Ramchandani and Heptula, was the plug-and-play devices. Now, when we talk about in hospital, what I would like to say about this is it's very cost prohibitive in some cases to implement, for us to say, okay, let's put this new glucose monitoring system on the current system, et cetera, but there are some new plug-and-play devices that actually attach to a cell phone, and they physically have they have a USB drive and they have software. So once the blood glucose is measured and monitored, it is automatically uploaded, and so within that algorithm in our current system, you can actually, without having anything additional and manually entering, the plug and play would help alleviate some of that. And those are relatively inexpensive because there's no cables, no wires, and they're readily available. That's one of the things that I thought was quite interesting, that system could be used regardless, and it could go with the patient. So we could take that from patient from the ICU into the medical unit, if they're transferred to another unit, that is their device. It is checked out to them, much like a blood pressure cuff would be. And because it doesn't require a cable, even if if the patient came off of a monitoring system, okay, it would automatically upload to the EMR, the electronic health record, and the nurse could open that up, and based on the patient's glucose, the algorithm would calculate the dosage. And I think for in-hospital, that would be a great option.
Okay, and actually, to go back to something you said earlier, Celeste, according to some research that I did, Williams et al. In the Critical Care Nurse Journal, 2012, utilizing telenursing just in the intensive care unit provides oversight for your nurses and provides that second set of eyes in the critical care environment. And I don't see any reason why, in this particular patient's situation or in any patient's situation, why that couldn't be a solution to the problem by continuing that telenursing, tele-ICU nursing, because as we know, on a medical unit, you are supposed to have a lower acuity on patients, and that's why you take more. So utilizing a telenursing situation would allow a nurse who maybe is not noticing a trend in his blood glucose going down or up to have somebody who's kind of watching over their shoulder to help help that, even if they're not utilizing the IIT CDSS on the floor. And then you also discussed the continuous glucose monitoring, and in relation to telenursing when he's outside of the hospital and discharge planning. This client was found in their home lethargic and non-communicative. The utilization of continued telehealth service even outside of the hospital, because they have certain check-in times typically, and things like that. According to Young et al. In the Journal of Telemedicine and eHealth, 2014, patients who are provided coaching from a nurse through telehealth report a higher level of self-efficacy, and this patient's blood glucose was controlled before these most recent issues. And if we can utilize this in a mixture with the other ideas that we've had for technology, he would have eyes on him all the time and maybe would not be found in his home non-responsive, but the trend for his glucose going down would be found first. So he could be taken to his clinic and have an outpatient visit rather than it lowers his readmission risk, which is also very important on the monetary side of things.
I totally agree. I really see the benefit of the telehealth moving forward from in this particular patient's instance, especially when you have multiple comorbidities. We've like I said, we have the trifecta there. You know, we're setting this patient up for failure, and there are numerous studies. I don't have them with me in regards to patient readmission to the ICU once discharged. I mean, we're all familiar with that cycle that can occur. So getting that patient, starting that transfer process and that communication early with a solid discussion, the use of a nurse, even like a nurse liaison. To go back to your point, Adele, I think you and I probably read, again, most of the same studies. Sounds like we have a lot of the same information, but even a nurse liaison, that an advanced practice nurse, maybe even a CCRN, critical care registered nurse, certified, that would go to the unit and help with that transition, and help coach and encourage and support, help support and encourage that med-surg nurse and saying, you can do this, and I'm your colleague, and I'm going to help back you up on this. We're not going to set you up for failure, but we're actually going to put things into place to not take over the care of your patient, but to back you up and to help give you that second set of eyes. And these are the tools that we're going to use to help you do that.
And Celeste, I completely agree. And if we implement a plan of train the trainer, so to speak, where we are educating the nurse educators on the floor, and then they will educate their staff, I think that is a great step in the right direction in getting everybody on the same page. And two, I'd like to point out, just as a side note, in transferring any critical patient from from critical care to a medical surgical floor if the nurses do have a question, or if they run into a situation where they need an extra set of hands, they can always call a rapid response as well. So I'd like to throw that out there too, as a big advocate of that rapid response teams that we have in place.
Absolutely.
So to review, our the evidence-based plan that we are considering instituting involves first and foremost, when the patient stabilizes, and well, actually first and foremost, making sure the IIT CDSS is utilized correctly in the ICU, and that overrides are held to a minimum, because we know that those cause issues due to the Campion article. The secondary is when the patient is stabilized and is transferring to MedSurg or the medical unit. We're going to utilize a comprehensive bedside report that utilizes the electronic health record, in addition to protocol paperwork that shows what the patient's glucose trends have been and why the glucose has been, or the insulin drip has been titrated and when. And then we're also going to include, from Teresa's spectrum, of maybe instituting a Plan Do Act or Plan Do Study Act situation that explains and educates the other units on what exactly IIT CDSS is, so that even if they're not utilizing it, they understand what's been going on in the patient's care in the critical care unit. We're going to continue telehealth or tele-ICU nursing, even though the client will be on the med-surg floor, because that will give a second set of eyes. And then we will move forward with discharge planning involving, hopefully, if we can get it okayed, continuous blood glucose monitoring, and outside of the hospital telehealth nursing. But that's in the future. Just particularly for this move to the med-surg, those are our actions that we plan on implementing.
I totally agree.
Absolutely.
Yes, I'm in agreement with that. Everyone did a great job coming up with some solutions and information. Good job, everyone.
Our patient care will be enhanced by what we've come up with.
I think so. I think so. The only thing I'd like to say in addition to all that is I'd like to see, with what we're recommending, I'd like to see some evaluation on this case. You know, post-discharge, I'd like to go back and say, talk to the nurse and look at the data. Did this plan make a difference? You know, we're all data-driven. The facility is as well, and the things that we're doing. I just want to make sure that we perhaps at our next meeting talk about a follow-up evaluation post-discharge, and maybe even at the 90-day mark, that if these things are instituted, did we have a readmission, and did the things that we decide to do make a difference?
Absolutely. And to include, I mean, if we can include an overlap of telehealth ICU nursing, maybe on all our patients in the first couple days after they are discharged from the ICU and transferred to the medical unit floor, it might actually provide help for all our critical care patients who are moving to the medical unit.
I think so, and the research staff would love a new research study, I'm sure.
Absolutely. Okay, guys, I'm going to go ahead and stop the broadcast, and we can have some like debriefing, okay?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.